back in the 80s, Andy Line Company. Andy makes monofilament, makes some braid too. Good. They were the premier line company back in the 80s, and braid wasn't really around then, so it was all mono. They had a contest, and on the west coast of the U.S. and the east coast of the U.S., they had two separate lists, but the list had 30 fish on it that you had to catch and release using Andy monofilament. You could use Andy monofilament in your leader if you were fly fishing. If you weren't, then you need to have Andy on your reel. And that was a period in my life where I had quit being a guide. And I said, well, actually, my kids were getting young, were getting older, and I needed to spend some time with them. I'm going to tell a story because it happened right out here. We were coming back from Boca Grande, and at that time I was living in Boca Grande, and well, we had a house rented down there, and I was spending most of my time guiding down there, and my kids were with me. My daughter was 8, and my son was 4, and right out here on the interstate, riding along my old Ford Bronco, just the three of us, my daughter said, "Dad, Billy and I want you to get a new job." And I said, "Well, why?" He said, "Because you're never home." I went, "Holy shit." It hit me like a 2x4. And I said, right then, I said, "Okay, I promise you right now, I'm done being a guide. I have, the rest of the year, I have a number of trips on the books, but I'm finished after that." And and then I went on to coach a little league, do that kind of stuff. And it was great. Whenever that was all done, I started back up again. But I couldn't just cold turkey quit. I had to have something to do when it became fishing. I mean, I was just fishing. So this tournament had 30 fish, and I started looking at it. And as I looked at the list, I said, I could probably get 15, 16, 17 of these, just normal fishing. And there were things like snook, redfish, speckled trout, Spanish mackerel, king mackerel, things like that. And so I started messing around with it. I got 13 or 14, and I said, and Tarpon was one. And I said, well, okay. And when you got to 20, you got the designation of master angler, and all 30 was grandmaster angler. So I said, well, I think I'm gonna go get this 20. I can get that. And I think I went down to the Keys and caught a bonefish and a permit and something else. Anyway, I got 20, and I was the first person to be a master angler. So my wife and I were talking about it, and I was kind of looking, and at the time, something else that I did to take up my time that I did when I was guiding, I was a sales rep for a company called Fishing International, and they were at the time, the second largest worldwide fishing travel agency behind Frontiers at that time. And so one of the perks of being a travel agent, I quickly learned, was that there were resorts who would have you come and stay with them for free to write about their resort and learn about their resort, so you could bring your clients to their place. And there were some packages that the travel agency had, that airline packages that made it easy to do. And they were out of Santa Rosa, California, so I was running their Florida branch down. I started up their Florida branch down here. So the other 10 fish on the list were fairly exotic. There was blue marlin, and then there was sailfish, white marlin, then there was brown trout, northern pike, drawing a blank on what some of them, but there were some big fish I had to travel for. Rainbow trout was one, or some others. Barracuda was some, that I could catch down the Keys and stuff. But there were 10 that I knew I was going to really have to travel. So I started talking with my wife, and she said, well, I thought you told me you were going to quit when you got to 20. And I said, Al, she said, you're not going to quit. I know you're not going to do that. And I said, well, honey, I've got this great opportunity with this travel agency to do this. Anyway, go ahead. So I traveled. When I went somewhere, I tried to do 2 or 3 species on a trip. When I went up to British Columbia for northern pike and things like that, I tried to get the smallmouth bass, and I did some research and got 2 or 3 that I could do it on a trip. And I learned when you talk to a resort that they say, oh yeah, well, you can catch a northern pike, no problem, no problem. And got serious on this thing, so I stayed 3 days at every resort or every place that I was fishing, just to make sure the weather and things like that. But one thing did happen. I went up to get the northern pike, and we flew into the place in British Columbia, and on a float plane. As we pulled the float plane up and got off the plane, the guy said, "Who's the guy here to catch the northern pike?" And I said, "Well, that'd be me." He handed me a rod, and he said, "Go throw it right off the corner of this floating dock back toward the tree on the shore." So I walked in, and he had a spoon of some kind. I threw it out there. First cast, I hooked a northern pike. I said, "Whoa, leave my bags on the plane. I'm going to the next stop." But I spent 3 days there, and it was a great experience to do that. I met lots and lots of people who were very, very helpful. People I didn't even know, because some of these species I had to do some research on. Like African pompano was one. African pompano it's hard to target African pompano, and it certainly was hard to target 30 years ago. You more than likely caught them incidentally fishing different places you ran across them. So I started calling around. A buddy of mine said, after 2 or 3 calls, one guy led another, he said, "Call this guy in Fort Pierce. He can target African pompano." And I said, "There's no way." He said, "Yeah." So I called him, and I talked to the guy, and he sounded like he knew what he was talking about. And he said, "Come on, Rod, I'll take you." So some of the trips, I must admit, were total bomb outs. Some people that wanted to take me had caught one once in their life, but they weren't, they didn't have them targeted in. But they were nice people, and I got to meet them. But I drove all the way over to Fort Pierce, and going, boy, I don't know about this. But the guy pulled up in a 23 Seacraft, rigged up nice. That's a good start. And we went out and sabikied up some threadfin herring. And I didn't think that African pompano would bite a threadfin herring. I was thinking pompano would be a crab or a jig or something like that. And we went out to a wreck off of Fort Pierce, and not too deep, so we could easily see the shore. And he said, and he had a 3 or 4 foot wire leader. I go, "Wire leader? Are you kidding me? And you don't catch pompano wire leaders. He said, "Believe me, you want a wire leader." So I said, "Okay." So he said, "Free line this thing out." We made a drift, free line this thing out. I got a bite. I caught this African pompano was 29 something pounds, and at the time there was a tournament in Miami called the Metropolitan Miami. It was called the Met. It was a big, big tournament down in South Florida, and it came up all at the East Coast. It wasn't much on the West Coast, but it ended up winning the largest African pompano released in the Met tournament. And he dropped down 2 or 3. We dropped down 2 or 3 other times and caught African pompano in every drift. And it was about 8:30. He said, "You ready to go?" I said, "Well, I guess." I got what we needed. And he said, "Yeah, no problem." I said, "The name of Mike Hogan." I said, "Mike, I can't believe you could target these things." And so he did, and we got to African pompano. And people ask, what was the hardest fish to catch? And the one that I thought was going to be the hardest fish to catch was the African pompano, just because it was hard to target. I thought I might have to go to the Bahamas or somewhere, and then it was just a shot in the dark. Then that would be the hardest, and one of the easiest I thought to catch would be the white marlin. And I had been through this travel agency. I had spent a lot of time in Venezuela, and half a dozen or more trips down there. And in the 80s, the fishing in Venezuela was just off the charts for billfish. You don't want to go down there now because of the military unrest and all that stuff, politics. But at the time, Americans were welcome down there, and we were taking a lot of people down there. So I knew that in September and October, the white marlin were off the charts, easy, no problem. I booked a trip of guys to go down there and told them what we were doing, and they said, "Well, come on, go with us, and for 3 days, and we'll let you, every marlin that comes up, we'll let you hook it, and then if it's not a white marlin, blue marlin, sailfish, then you give it to us, and we'll catch it." So that's fine. So this is going to be a piece of cake. 3 days, we caught blue marlin and sailfish till we were tired, not one white marlin. And I remember it was those guys run 9 to 5 or whatever the time was, probably 8 to 4. That the captain was already talking to them into the shore, and I went up there about it was 4 o'clock. I went about 3:30. I'm sitting on the bridge with the captain, and I'm saying, "I'm not going home. I'm not going home and coming back down here. I'm staying. You got to get me a boat, because I only needed one more to get the Grandmaster Angler. This is my last one. And I said, are you open tomorrow? He says, no, but so he was talking to the guys inshore to see if he can find me another boat. I was going to stay till I caught one. And I hollered down to my buddies downstairs. I said, man, this is the fourth quarter, and the time is running out. And sure enough, right as I said that, 2 white marlin came out. And I ran down there, and I hooked one, and saw him jumping. It was a white. I put it in the rod holder, and then I went over to the other one, got him hooked up, and saw him, and so I started fighting him, saw it was a white. So I fought him for a while, and he jumped off. And so time's running out, Captain wants to go home, and I'm fighting this white marlin as the clock is running out, like the Lightning game last night. So,
Oh, God.
and so we get the white marlin up, and he's hooked in the eyeball, and his eyeball's hanging out here, and the hook's out here. But it's still connected somehow in the eye socket. I said, I'm not going to catch this. Somehow or another, I caught it. And so we took pictures and did all that, and it was a big hoopla, and, very few beers. And so that's basically the Grandmaster Angler story. It took me 2.5 years to do it. I was the second one to do Grandmaster Angler. There was a fish biologist on the West Coast, and he did that list before I did it. I did the Master Angler first, and he did the Grandmaster Angler, and then I got the Grandmaster Angler in about 2.5 years. So not long after that, Andy stopped that program. So there's only 2 Grandmaster Anglers in the world now. And we're going to be that forever until they start it back. And I want to tell you, I milked that thing. Look, this is my book, Fish Smart, Catch More, available on my website, fishingwithbillmiller.com for $19.95. If you look in the first page of the book, and there's Grandmaster Angler, because it's what people have always asked about. And I don't know why they didn't keep doing it, because it was a terrific, they didn't give you anything for it. You got a patch, and they gave me a windbreaker with a patch on it and a monogram thing. So I mean, it wasn't any big deal, there's no money involved. But boy, did I work that thing for 35 years. Still do. Anyway, that's the story. One of the fishing here, of course, was the tarpon. And I've been fishing for tarpon all my life. Caught my first tarpon when I was 7 down in Boca Grande. It was about 30 years ago or so.
Tell the same story for 30 years.
You've weathered rough, man.
So caught my first tarpon when I was 7. People asked me what's your favorite fish to fish for, and I said there's tarpon and there's everything else. So I love tarpon, and I fished many moons ago here in Tampa. There was a couple of tarpon tournaments. The Tampa tarpon tournament the boundary was the Skyway Inn, and then there was the Suncoast Tarpon Roundup, which is still in existence today. And you could fish up in Tampa Bay, but you could also fish down the Gulf beaches. You can still do that on the Suncoast Tarpon Roundup. And the Tampa tournament was a really, really competitive tarpon tournament. And there was a group of folks that lived down in Gibson and down in Ruskin down here. Some of the names were, you may remember, was one of those aged was Goodyear, Fullwood, Doyle Carlton. There's 2 or 3 that I know you know. But anyway, the families are still here down here in this area. And they were really good fishermen. And they fished basically from a line from about here over to MacDill and toward downtown. And then there was another group that fished this area over in here some, and certainly came around over there. And when I was in college, we fished it all the time. And some of our favorite places were Davis Island and all around Bayshore, and then down over by Whiskey Stump in the Yalapai Spoils in that area over there. And I'll talk about some of this. Apollo Beach right out here was a hot spot late in the year. So I'll talk about all of that. And tarpon could be a 4, 5, 10. It could be a 10-hour course, having to cover all the different ways to tarpon fish and how to do it. So I'm going to just kind of make it simple tonight. But if you guys have any questions while we're going on, raise your hand. If you want to know where to fish, how to fish, I don't know the experience of everybody, but what I just thought I'd do is start out just kind of talking about tarpon and what they like to eat. And I'll show you some of the tackle that I use, and then I'll do my best to tell you some spots that you can fish close by here, and all over Tampa Bay. But I'm reading a book called Tales of Old Florida, and it's a really cool book, and most of the stories in this book now are from the 1800s, the late 1800s. And it was talking about how the folks tarpon fished back then. The reels back then didn't have a drag on it. All they had was a leather pad that they put on the spool. But the reels were multipliers, meaning one turn of the handle might be 2 or 3 of the spool line. They didn't have any drags. And the way they did it, they went on a sailboat and they drug a little boat behind them, and they went out in these areas and they anchored, and they threw out a dead mullet on the bottom. Each guy had a rod, and they let it sit there, and they talked about drinking and eating and smoking cigars on the sailboats. And then when they hooked one, they jumped down in the little rowboat, and they had a guide, and he rowed after them, rowed after the tarpon, and they tried to catch them. So that the technique of fishing a dead mullet on the bottom, this is the one story I was reading last night, was from 1890, and is still effective today. And bottom fishing for tarpon with mullet, or with some other things I'll mention, pinfish and Gulf midnight, which is called a shad around here, is one of the most effective ways to fish for tarpon still today. And I'm going to talk about that. Live bait fishing is also a really popular way. A couple things they talked about in the book too that were neat. You may have seen on TV or heard people say that a lot of times you hear them say when a tarpon jumps, you want to bow to the tarpon. And the reason you do that is because if there's tight line on the tarpon and he swings his head to you and puts some slack in the line, and then he slams it back the other way, it just puts slack in the line and pulls it tight, and that's the way it breaks. So you want to kind of just flex your knees and point the rod at him and give him a little bit of a slack so they won't break the line. And we've got all this high-tech braided line and monofil and everything. These guys in the 1890s, as I'm reading this story, the guide is telling this angler guy from some blue blood guy from New York, bow to the fish, and he explains it just the exact same thing I said. I'm like, that's incredible. I kind of thought that was a thing that was developed down by the light tackle pioneers down in South Florida, but no, in the 1800s they were using that technique. And today, if you get a tarpon up close to the boat, and he starts running the boat, you've got to stick your rod way down in the water and work it around the motor and around the boat like that to keep it from breaking off. I thought that was something kind of new. The guide was telling the guy the same thing in this book, that to put your rod under the water and work it around the boat like that. So 3 things that I thought were fairly new to this century or the century before were not at all. There's some of the basics of when tarpon fishing was started: dead bait on the bottom, bow the fish, and stick your rod down the boat, around in the water to keep from going on the boat. Tarpon like live bait, and certainly one of the most popular live baits for tarpon is a threadfin herring, or a greenback it's called, a scale sardine or a white bait, a pinfish, and a crab, a silver dollar crab, about that size like that. Those are really, really popular baits, and then that's the live bait side, and then the dead bait side is the mullet, pinfish, and then the shad, which is the Gulf midnight. Most people up here in Tampa Bay fished for tarpon in the early days with live bait under a cork. They'd get to an area where the tarpon were rolling, and they'd throw out this cork, and they'd spot cast to the tarpon if they were rolling enough, or if they didn't, they'd throw out some corks with live bait on and drift through the area where the tarpon are. And that's a really, really good technique to use today. And a spinning rod like this, it's a 7.5, 8-foot spinning rod, fairly stout, with a reel. I got about 350 yards of braid on here, and that's really, you don't need that much. Certainly, if the fish gets more than about 200 yards of line out, you're screwed. You're not going to catch it anyway. So you can forget about that. But anyway, you got it on there. And the leader, I use 50-pound braid, and the leader that I use for my cork apparatus is a 60-pound fluorocarbon leader. You could use 80. And then I use a circle hook. You don't have to use a circle, you can use a J hook. This is it's either either 6 or 7/0 circle hook, and if I was going to use a J hook, I would use a 5/0 J hook. And I like to use a Gamakatsu J hook, 5/0 Gamakatsu, extra strong. This is an Ohiro hook. I've been using Ohiro J circle hooks, and they work really well. You can tie a loop knot if you'd like, or you could tie a straight clinch knot. And this one I tied a clinch knot, probably well, not on that one. Another one I might have a loop knot. I kind of do whatever hits me at the time. The idea of a loop knot is that if it's a live bait, the loop will let the hook swing in the loop and give the bait a little more action, as opposed to this, he wouldn't get as much and he might have to drag the bait around a little bit. Honestly, after all these years, I don't really know if there is a difference. The main thing to me, especially when you're using big fish, is to tie whatever knot you know will hold. That's the main thing. If you don't know how to tie a loop knot, or you've had some issues with it, then don't tie it. This is a straight, improved clinch knot, and if you know how to tie that, it's tight, tie it. When you get up into a little higher monofilament, 60-pound improved clinch knot is no problem. The improved clinch knot is 5 times around, then back through the loop you formed at the eye of the hook, and then back through that loop and tighten it down. When you get up to about 80 pounds, 100 pounds, that's a hard knot to tie. Yep. So the knot that I recommend for the 80 or the 100 pound is just a 3-turn simple clinch knot. You go around the leader 3 times and then back through the loop and clinch it down. And that's a really simple knot. It will hold, if you tie it right, and it's not hard to tie, it will hold any tarpon or anything else like that you want to catch. One thing I do recommend when you're tying these knots is moisten them when you get ready to tighten them. Put a little spit on them and tighten them down. It'll slide down, they'll tighten up real quick, real tight. When knots break, it's because they're not tight and they start to slip. If the knot starts to slip when you put pressure on it, as it slips, it creates heat, and that's what breaks it. As it slips, the heat's created and the monofilament gives away. So I've tied on here, I'm going to talk about a live bait outfit. I've got 4 or 5 feet of this 60-pound mono. That would be about 5 feet, 4.5. And then I tie it to my braid, and again, whatever knot you want to tie. You could tie a swivel right here to the mono and then tie to the braid. That's an easy way to do it. Or a double uni knot, or this is a no-name knot. Yes.
You mentioned mono, you're not using fluoro?
Fluoro, I'm in fluoro.
Okay.
Yeah. All my leaders tarpon fishing for live bait fishing will be fluorocarbon. And I just tie them together with whatever knot holds for you, and you're ready to go. These corks, you can, when you're in an area that some fish are rolling, and in an open bay type area where there's not a huge tidal flow like the Skyway, for instance, I like to put out some lines with corks, a couple lines with corks, and then I'll free line a couple of baits out there. And I'll either anchor where I see the fish rolling, or I'll drift through the area. And then you just got to kind of see what happens. And then they start, whatever you see them starting to bite, if they bite, then go with that. If they're biting the free line baits with no cork, then that's the one you want to use. If they're biting the corks, then you want to use that. Now, I said what they're going to bite if they bite. Tarpon are notorious for being all over the place, and they don't want a thing to do with what you're offering. So the only way to really figure that out, or even get close to figuring it out, is just remember where you are. If the tarpon are there, they're going to bite sometime if they're in an area. You may not want to sit there all day and wait to see if they're going to bite. But say you were fishing them on the incoming tide one day, and you didn't get any bites. Then you might say, I'm going to go out tomorrow and see if these fish are here on the outgoing tide. I'm going to try them on the outgoing tide. And then if that doesn't work, you might want to say, well, sometimes no matter what, and I know this for a fact, tarpon will bite at first daylight. There'll be a bite at first daylight, and there'll be a bite when the sun goes down. And it usually doesn't matter what the tide is. Sometimes if the tide and everything is right, it will be a really good bite. And but others times it won't be as good, but they will bite right at first daylight and right as the sun goes down. If you find some tarpon in an area that is non-tidal, like out here off of Apollo Beach, and after I fish will bite on the top, but if you really want them to bite good, fish them on the bottom. And you can use these spinners just like this. But what I like to use is this, I like to use these heavy rods. These are, I don't know, this rod, I've had it rewrapped, I don't know how old it is. It's 30, 40 years old. This is 8.5 and 4/0 center, 300 pound, 300 yards of 50-pound mono. When I'm bottom fishing tarpon like that, I like to use mono. Braided line doesn't do you any good. Mono works just as fine, it's a lot less expensive. And so you use 50-pound mono. And then since if you're fishing them on the bottom, stealth is not really an issue. It's a dead bait on the bottom. And if you've seen underwater photography, tarpon are really bottom feeders. They love to go along the bottom of their jaw. When somebody draws a tarpon, a lot of the artists, when they draw a tarpon, they draw them all wrong. They draw a fish with a head like that, and then they put the mouth right in the center, right at the point, coming back like that. Tarpon's mouth isn't on the point. The point of his mouth comes around and it's underneath. It's actually under here. Tarpon's mouth opens like this. And they have, this part of their mouth is a real scoop on it. So they'll get along and they'll go along, they'll just come down and scoop something right off the bottom. So bottom fishing for tarpon is a real good way to do it. And these are the rigs that we use for bottom fishing for tarpon. Since stealth isn't really involved, these are 150-pound mono. They get a big tarpon on there, I only catch it. And the hook is a 9.0 extra strong. We use this Gamakatsu J hook. The 150-pound mono is hard to tie, so use a crimp. You can crimp it. That crimp will not give under any circumstances. If you try to tie 150-pound mono, it's going to be hard to do. It's really hard to do. You don't need to use 150-pound. You can use 100-pound. I can get away with 80, but a lot of times when a tarpon picks the bait up off the bottom, they'll get it down up into here somewhere. And if you use a lighter monofilament, eventually to get this fish on for a while, the tarpon who don't have any teeth, but they have sandpaper lips, it'll eventually wear through and bust you off. The leader is about a 5-foot leader, and I do use a swivel at this end and just tie it straight to the mono. Leader length is, some guys get into debates over leader length. If you're thinking about catching big fish, then ideally you want to leader the length of the fish that you catch, because the idea is the tail will come back. If I'm catching a 4-foot fish and I've got a 5-foot leader and he's hooked in his mouth up here and he's swimming away from me, as his tail swims and bangs on the line, he's going to bang on the 150-pound mono. But the tarpon, you get 6-foot tarpon, no problem, and some even more, but a 6-foot leader is just, it's hard to handle, hard to cast, it's just hard for everything. So I make the leader what's easy for me to cast, and this is a 9-foot rod, so I got a 5-foot leader on here. I can put a bait on this thing, wing it out there. As much leader as I can use that I can cast is what I like. Same thing for the live bait. People say, well, you got to have a long leader, the tarpon will tail whip it. Well, yeah, you could have a 6 or 7-foot leader with this, but you could never cast it. So we use a 4 or 5-foot leader, and on this, don't use any swivel, because on this one, a lot of these spinning rods, you want to, a lot of times, if that cork's not on there, I'll reel this much up into the rod, so that when I've got a live bait and I can see a tarpon, I really want to wing it, I can rear back and get it going if I've only got this much out. If I've got 6 foot out, it's hard to get any bend on the rod. It just gets in the way. But when you have no swivel, you can do that. But when I'm using a bigger rod like this, I can get away with a 5-foot leader. You can probably get away with a 6-foot leader. So you're in the same area I was talking about, and fish are rolling around you. So what we do is we get a dead bait, and say the easiest bait to get is mullet, a dead mullet, and or pinfish. If you get a pinfish, you want a good hand-sized pinfish, bigger the better. And you take the pinfish, and there's a lot of ways to do it. You can start from the tail and fillet it up right to the gills, but don't cut it off on both sides, and hook it in the tail. So if you hook it upside down with the tail, the flaps are laying off like this. The only reason you do that is get some scent out in the water. You can also take that pinfish and go up and down, make 3 or 4 slices on his body to get a little bit, same way like that. If the crab's trash fish are bad, and you fillet the pinfish, they'll eat it. He'll eat it. They'll eat it all up, and your bait won't last very long. So you make little slips in it and throw it out there. And basically, you throw it out there and let it sit on the bottom. What we do with these, in the old days, we used to throw these lines out, and we'd leave it out of gear with the clicker on. And we throw it out, let it sink to the bottom, and then we pull out maybe 10, 20 feet of line and just let it coil on the bottom, and we watch it. And when that line started going, the only reason we put the clicker on at that point was just if he got tight on you real quick, it wouldn't backlash when he started going. And you watched all that line go. We used to take cut little pieces of 1x2s or anything, any piece of wood or an empty Coke can and set it on the coil line. And when the tarpon started peeling off with it, you'd watch the line, the Coke can would fall over, something like that. Or if you were sleeping, then you just put the clicker on and let it go. It'd wake you up when you got one. And
Tough life.
Did you put weights on the end of it to keep it down on the bottom?
no, but using those things, if you're not in a tidal situation, you're fishing out here in the bay, and you don't need a weight. You might want to put. Sometimes we'll put a little weight here, a little pinch on or rubber core sinker right here, maybe an ounce or something like that, just enough to get it to the bottom. Most of the time when you're doing this, you're fishing in 10, 12, maybe 15 or less feet. So the idea back in the day was to let them swallow that thing as far as they could swallow it, because when you set the hook on, you wanted it down in here somewhere so you weren't going to lose it. Of course, we were killing most every fish back in those days, so certainly we don't do that anymore. And so what we do today is you throw it out and let it sit on the bottom, and we use just enough line to let it get on the bottom and lay loose, put it in rod holder, and just let it sit. And when that line comes tight and he folds that rod over, the drag goes and the rod bends usually about that time he's jumping. And there's whatever the formula is, there's usually enough slack in the line to let the tarpon get it in his mouth and get right about it back in here, not down in his gills or down in his throat or stomach. You hook him or in the mouth just about every single time. And so you want a sharp hook, like the laser sharpened hooks that are out there today. And there's times when we're fishing, we'll put 8 of these out. And I've got, on my boat, I've got 12 rod holders, and we'll look like a porcupine with rods sticking out everywhere. And, we've got more rods out, the better chance you get, to catch a fish, but you don't need to do that. You can put out a couple on the good way to do it. If you can put out one on the bottom, one on the top, or a couple on the bottom, a couple on the top. And that's basically, those are the ways that you bay fish for tarpon. Now, I'm going to tell you some good spots now that you might want to look and try that. I'll tell you one of the spots in the recent years that's been really good is the Bahia Beach Reef right out here. Those tarpon get on this Bahia Beach Reef. And the way that I would fish it is look where you see them rolling. Now out there at the Bahia Beach Reef, you get a little bit of tide out there. And but I would get up in front of those fish where I see them rolling and use some live baits. First thing I would start with was a free line live bait. And I would drift with my motor off through this area where I see the tarpon rolling and see if that worked. If I didn't get any bites that way, I might try a cork. Then I would get up in front of them. Or if they stay in the same place, I would get up in front of them and I'd put a couple of live baits. And what I'm thinking about here is the big threadfin herring. You can use a sabiki rig in the summertime, and now there's plenty of them out here in the bay. You can sabiki them around the markers out there, the bigger tripod markers, or if you could get the big scale sardines, that's just as good. I would get up in front of them where I see them rolling, and I'd hook them 2 baits in the nose and put them back about 50, 60, 70 feet. And if I had a number of those thread fins, or scale sardines, I would cut them in about thirds and chum a little bit like that. Now, if you chum too much, you're going to get Spanish mackerel coming in there and eating your baits and cutting them off. So that's a kind of a catch-22, especially out here around the reef. But if you got out there and you chum with some of those thread fins or scale sardines, you also can get the grouper coming up off that reef, and those are good. You can keep those in the summertime and July 1st. So there's some extra bonus. So you do catch other stuff doing it. But I would fish them that way. That's That's the way I would do it. And then when the tide slacked off, then I would take some baits. You can also put that threadfin herring on the bottom, and I would put some down on the bottom. And right as the tide's starting to slack, put them on the bottom. If you need a weight, like you said, put a weight on there and get it down on the bottom. And that's a really good way to catch fish. Another place where the tarpon get, and I think they're there right now, is right out off of MacDill where the main channel connects with the channel coming from Weed Island. It's 50, 60 feet out there. That's a hard place to fish at times, but the fish do get out there in good numbers. You look around the bait schools, you'll see them out there. And the way you fish them out there is you drift. You use the thread fins or scale sardines or pinfish, something like that, and just pitch it out there, put out 60, 70 feet of line, 100 feet of line, just drift through there. You may want to try some on the top with a cork, some free line, and then put some on a sinker and drop it down to the bottom. You might try drifting through there. You can bottom fish them out there, but it's a real hard area to bottom fish, being so deep. And there's a lot of sharks and stuff like that, so it's really hard to bottom fish. Another good area for tarpon, I'll bet there's some there right now too, is right down they're either the slow speed or the manatee markers that run down to Apollo Beach. About 3 or 4 markers this side of Apollo Beach, going the channel going in there. There's some live bottom in there. There's some hard bottom in there. And if you go in there early in the morning, you might see some tarpon rolling in there. And if you do, that's a real good place to bottom fish them because it's only 6, 8, 10 feet deep. So you could put something on the bottom, a pinfish, a mullet. And when you use a mullet about 12, 14 inches is good, and then cut him in half. And I don't know why the idea of cutting them at an angle, where that came from, but we always cut them at an angle. Maybe I don't know why they do it. We'll hook the mullet through the lips, bottom up like that, and then the tail of the mullet, hook him through the tail. You can either come sideways or you can go through the backbone. Either way, it doesn't matter, as long as it stays on the hook. Fresh mullet's better than frozen mullet. Fresh mullet's better, fresh pinfish better than frozen pinfish, but they all work. So if you catch a bunch of mullet one day, you think you might want to go tarpon fishing, just freeze them, and they'll work on the bottom. They'll work. Same with big hand-side pinfish. That's a good spot right there. As you go around the corner, the area from the power plant, and I'll say the north side of the power plant, the channel that comes in on the north side, from there all the way down to the Alphi River. That area in there, it's a big, wide open area. And the best way, the only way to really find them in there is on a real calm day. But if it's real calm, you'll see those tarpon rolling in there. And what you want to do there in those areas, the most productive thing is you come into an area and you see some tarpon rolling, just shut your boat off and drift. And just kind of watch. And you'll see more in one area than another. And you say, okay, it looks like most of them are rolling. There's some here, but the majority of them is right there. So I'll eyeball that area, and when I get that area eyeball, I'll see one roll in that area. And say I'm looking in an area as big as this room or 2 rooms like this. But I know they're all around. I got this one area where they seem to be concentrated. I'll see one roll, and I'll say, okay, and I'll go right to where he rolled and drop my anchor right in the circle that he made when he rolled. Quietly, you don't want to run in, you want to putt in there. Drop your anchor over quietly and anchor right there, and just pitch out some baits on the bottom, maybe one or two on the top. I don't have a stereo on my boat. I want to hear things, especially when I'm tarpon fishing. I'll hear them roll sometimes, I won't see them. But I got to tell you, at times, bottom fishing for tarpon can be pretty boring. So you might want to have a radio to listen to, or some kind of entertainment. You certainly might want to have some sunscreen on you. Sunshade on your boat, because a lot of times you're sitting out there in the sun for a while. But bottom fishing for tarpon, fishing for tarpon anyway, at times can be pretty boring because they're not going to bite all the time. But it seems like that when you throw dead baits on the bottom, you just sit there and wait, and that seems to be maybe a little more boring than other types of fishing, but it is really, really effective. This past year in the So it does work. The live bait fishing maybe is a little more fun because you're casting and you're doing things like that, but bottom fishing does work, yes.
Where were you using this bait?
We were using shad, the Gulf menhaden. You know,
So, in your opinion, does it work better if, say you had to go to Mastery and get the shad, is it worth that effort over mullet or pinfish?
Probably. Yeah, but if well, if you're not gonna get serious, but there's some tarpon over there, and we call that the Alafai spoils. They're over by Whiskey Stump. There's the island over there. Whiskey Stump is another good area. And I think I wanna go try some tarpon fishing this weekend. You know, and I'm not really sure that I wanna do it much, but I wanna try it. I don't wanna drive to or pay somebody to go catch me these shad, because that's the hard part with fishing. The shad on the bottom is hard to catch. You only catch with a cast net. It used to be plentiful out here in Tampa Bay. The purse seiners would come from right here in the Little Manatee River, where Guthrie had his fish house, and then they'd come right out there to the point of Macville. Then around the corner, they'd wrap purse seines around these huge 100,000-pound strikes of shad, Gulf menhaden. And, you know, to this day, I don't know why they haven't come back. Catching shad for bait was no issue. You could pull up to the purse seiners out there, and they knew they were getting a lot of heat from people because they were just raping the bay basically. So they'd give you all the shad you wanted. They weren't hard to cast net at all because there were so many. But for some reason now that the bay's come back and the water quality of the bay now is as good as it's ever been. I read a story today from the Tampa Bay Estuary program. The water quality in the bay, based on their 1950 benchmark, is better today than it was in the 1950s. And I believe that. There's more grass in Tampa Bay now than there was in the benchmark time when they first took the survey in Tampa Bay, from the 50s to now. And we're gaining between 700 to 1,000 acres of seagrass a year in Tampa Bay. So Tampa Bay is a huge recovery program for a watershed like we have here. But why the shad haven't come back anymore, I don't know. If I wanted to get serious about it, I was fishing a tournament, blah, 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 I'd probably go pay somebody and buy some shad, or I'd drive over to Mastery's in St. Pete, and at times they had shad. But if I just wanted to go have a little fun with tarpon, then I'd use the pinfish or fresh mullet or ladyfish. Ladyfish work real good on the bottom too. Spanish mackerel do too because they're oily. Shad's real oily. Spanish mackerel, ladyfish, and all that. So anything fresh on the bottom like that is really pretty good. Yes, sir.
You ever tried cheddar crab or soft crab?
Blue crabs.
Yeah, I know, I've used
Yeah.
blue crabs, but, you know,
No.
I lived in the Outer Banks for a number of years,
Mhm.
and that was the bait of choice. When nothing worked,
Yeah.
soft crabs work. You know?
But they might.
So,
Yeah, they
I've never
might.
seen them use
I'd
that.
rather eat one than waste it.
Yeah, I wouldn't know where to get them other than in the restaurant over there.
Yeah.
But I would use that.
I have a friend that sheds about 10,000 crabs a season.
Yeah,
And I'll tell you what it is, the first full moon in June,
Mhm.
every year.
Yeah.
That's it.
When we lived in Delaware, fishing Delaware Bay, man, you can't imagine what we paid. I'm talking 25 years ago, what we paid for those baits. But if you didn't have them, you didn't catch any fish.
Yeah, yeah. The west side of Davis Island, the whole Bayshore area over there is a really good tarpon spot. Down the west side of Davis Island, all the way around Bayshore, out in front of the Colonnade, it swings around almost right up in front of the boat ramp at Ballast Point. It's a really good tarpon area. It's be really good right now. This time of year, May, the tarpon that show up will come up into Tampa Bay. In June, when they're getting in the spawning mode, it's going to be kind of barren up in here. They all go out around the Gulf and the mouth of the bay, and they go offshore to spawn. But then July and August, they'll come right back into the bay. And July and August and September, and I remember very well listening to the World Series when it used to be during the day on the radio, fishing off of right off the boat ramp at Ballast Point, actually around by Dill, there's a place out there called Long Bar, or sometime maybe called Long Shoal. That's another good place for tarpon. And sitting right there catching tarpon in October. The World Series is in October. So the fishing in the bay is really good July, August, September, and now. June will be a little bit light. So those are some spots. Now, if somebody was to ask me, Bill, you need to catch a tarpon today, or you're done, where would I go? I would go today, actually tomorrow. I would go to the Sunshine Skyway Bridge. The good thing about the Skyway Bridge is it is I guess it may be one of the longest artificial reefs in the world. And what that means is it attracts bait. You can go there and catch your bait. The threadfin herring are all over the Skyway Bridge. And I wouldn't bother trying to throw a cast net on them.
Good Lord, you won't lift the cast net out.
Yeah, if you get them right, then you're going to catch way too many for tarpon. But the best way to do it, the easiest way to do it, the cleanest way to do it, the least destructive on your body way to do it is to use a sabiki rig. And you can drop the sabiki rigs down there around the pilings and around some of the bigger range markers that are right there next to the Skyway, and you can sabiki up the threadfin herring. Then ride along real slowly on the bridge, whichever way the tide is going. If it's going out, then you'll ride on this side of the Skyway. If it's coming in, you go on the other side. Ride along slowly, from here to the door maybe, or a little bit closer, real slow, and look back in the stalls there. That's the openings at the Skyway Bridge. Look back in those stalls and look for fish rolling. If you see a fish roll, then remember that and keep riding along, see if you find anywhere else. And then what you do is you come back and you anchor right back to that stall, and you use a spinning rod like this, same hook setup, no cork, and hook the threadfin herring in the nose. And you run two back. You want to try to get them as close to the pilings as you can. Not necessarily that they're always around the pilings, but closer is better. And you want them back in the shade. The way I start is I start up above the shade line and fish back to the front part of the shade. And then I watch to see, sometimes the tarpon will roll on the back side of the bridge. As the tide comes through, it forms an eddy. And a lot of times they'll lay in that eddy because it's easier for them, and as the bait comes by and swirls around, they'll lay right there, and that's where they'll feed. If you see them back further in the stall, just let out some more anchor line, or you can re-anchor and get back. This is a nice part of tarpon fishing at the Skyway. You get right under the bridge and the shade is there. It's really nice, and makes it a whole lot easier if you're not catching any fish. And you just put some in the rod holder, run it back along the shade, space them out. One right in the shade line, or maybe one outside the shade line, back in the light, wherever you see the fish rolling. Try to set it up there. And then I like to take another one and do the same thing, hook the threadfin through the nose, and I'll look at the pilings. If I'm this close to a piling, it doesn't do me much good to cast over there. But if I'm this close to one piling, I'll be that close to the other piling. If they're about as wide as this, I'll take one. If the tide's going this way, I'll take that threadfin and I'll pitch him up there next to the piling where all the current is, and I'll just let it put out a bunch of line. I'll just let it drift back, let it drift back. Maybe I'll let a little bit of line, let it drift, let it drift, let it drift. If I don't get bit, then I'll reel it back up and I'll do it again. That's a real effective way. A couple lines back, stationary, staggered, and then take some and pitch them around the pilings and let it drift back naturally with the current. If you get a fish on, then what you need to do is somehow you need to get off of your anchor or pull the anchor. Pulling the anchor when you get a fish on and he starts running is going to be hard to do. So at the end of our anchor line, we tie a big orange buoy to the anchor rope. We have it anchored, it's tied up to the boat, and the rest of the anchor line, if there's a lot of it, we'll coil it up nicely and take a Velcro strap and strap it together so it's in a nice loop. And if we get a fish on, somebody will run up to the front, untie it, grab the loop line with the Velcro and the buoy and throw it overboard, and then you start your motor and you back up, and usually the fish will, first time they'll run that way, and you back up and start following out away from the bridge. Now, he may come back to the bridge, and if he does, it could get dicey. And the other day we had one that we were fishing up above the bridge, would suggest is get out around the main span. Don't anchor in the main span where the ships come through. But out there, there's this great big round bumpers. And find one of those places where there's, some of them real close together, where they're wider apart, and anchor up above some of them. If there's, I like to get where there's one over here and there's one here on each side of me. And I'm anchoring in those spots. And what I'll do is I'll run one back, maybe like that, but then I'll take two rods, two spinners like this with thread fins, and I'll pitch them up against those pilings and let them run back with the tide, maybe let them sit there for a minute on each side, and then I'll reel back up and I'll do it again. Those big bumpers out there are really popular spots. If you're in doubt about, well, is this the right place to fish or not, ride along and look till you see boats tarpon fishing. That's the easiest way to do it. If you don't know too much about it, because the odds are most of those people that are out there doing it do, and so you don't want to get in there close to them where you can get tangled up. But if they're in one stall, you could go to the stall next to them or down a little bit and just take your chances like that. But usually the tarpon are spread out in an area, so they're not just in one stall.
Do you ever drift through there?
Yeah, that's a good way to do it. If you don't want to anchor, and you want to have a good anchor when you go in there, because sometimes it's hard to anchor out there. You want to have minimum 150 feet of line and a heavy anchor that'll hold on the bottom. But if it's not too windy and it's not too, the current's not running extremely fast, you can drift through there, especially out there around the middle. You can go in there and drift. You don't need to drift. Sometimes you don't need to piling gear. You don't drift always that way. You'll drift between two. I'll go in one here, one here, one here. I'll go that way instead of that way. But it doesn't really matter because the tarpon lay in around those big bumpers out there, and pitching live baits around them like that's a real good way to do it.
Yeah.
One of the, this leads to a question. First time I ever went tarpon fishing with my baby brother, Jay-Z, I asked him, I said, how tight we gotta have this drag? He said, lock it down. I've never been tarpon fishing before. I only think we lived here 2 years, because when we first got the boat, and I hooked my first tarpon that I hooked was right there by those bumpers, and as soon as the head come out, bink!
Yeah.
And that's why I looked at my brother and I said, I'll never trust you again. Never, ever. Because I sit there and I grab on his line and it's as slack as can be. So how do you want your drag for the initial hookup, and then do you adjust it as you go, or?
Okay, good question. I won't adjust it. Well, I'll just show you. This drag is set for tarpon for me. If you want to come up here and pull it, that's fairly tight, but it still will put some pressure on the fish. If at any time during the fight that I feel like that I don't have enough, if I'm going to set my drag more one way than another, I'll set it looser one way than tighter. Because if it's tight, I don't want to be getting up here screwing around messing with my drag. If it's too tight, I don't want to be loosening it, because you can't ever tell. And when that drag, most of the time when you'll be loosening it, the drag will be going. And you'll loosen it, and the drag is hot and is expanding as it's going out. And the minute you loosen it, it really loosens up like that, and just goes, you're going to get a giant backlash. So don't do that. If you're going to do anything, set it a little bit light. And then what you can always do is put your thumb right here on the bottom of the spool. You can palm the spool a little bit. Now you got to be careful, but you can palm the spool a little bit if you need it. Most of the time, when the fish is running, I won't palm the spool. If he's running, pulling drag, I'm going to let him fight the drag. But when I will palm the spool is when I go to pull back on the fish. If you feel that drag slipping, when you go to pull back, you pull back, it goes, and then you reel up the line that slipped out. Reel up the line that slipped out. You're not gaining anything. What I'll do when I go to pull back is I'll lightly put my finger on somewhere on the spool, turn the other way. I'll put it down in here like this, and I'll be real careful. I'll pull back so the drag doesn't slip. Then I can reel up some line and actually gain some line. And you can adjust the drag like this, and it's kind of tricky, but once you get used to it, it'll work. if I was gonna set it one way or another, I would probably set it looser than I thought, but not too loose. That's a pretty good drag right there.